What if the stories we tell could heal the deepest wounds of war? Picture a society shattered by conflict, where battlefields leave scars, not just on the land, but on the hearts of those who survive. Now imagine that same society turning to the stage, not for escape, but for transformation. This was ancient Greece, a civilization that understood something profound about the human spirit. When words fail, art speaks. Across the sun-drenched amphitheaters of Athens and beyond, Greek theater became more than entertainment. It was a sacred space where trauma was confronted, where the chaos of war was given meaning, and where fractured communities found a path back to each other. Think of the last time a story moved you to tears or made you see the world differently. That power, the ability to reshape our understanding of pain, was harnessed over 2,000 years ago in ways that still resonate today. Greek tragedies didn't just depict suffering, they ritualized it. Audiences gathered not as passive spectators, but as active participants in a collective reckoning. When the chorus wept for the fallen heroes of Troy or the families torn apart by vengeance, every citizen in the crowd felt it. These weren't just plays, they were mirrors held up to a society learning to process its own scars. And here's what's astonishing. The very mechanisms these ancient storytellers used, catharsis, empathy, shared narrative, are the same tools modern psychology now recognizes as vital for healing trauma. So how did they do it? How did the Greeks turn the raw materials of war, grief, rage, loss, into something that could bind rather than break? The answer lies in the alchemy of drama, where personal pain becomes universal truth. Take the story of the Orsteia, a trilogy that grapples with cycles of violence and the possibility of justice, or Aristophanes' comedies, which used laughter to disarm tensions between rival city-states. These works didn't shy away from darkness, they walked straight into it, lantern in hand, and showed their audiences a way out. As we unravel the secrets of this ancient practice, you'll begin to see its echoes everywhere, from wartime poetry to modern therapeutic theater. This is the untold story of how art became medicine and how the Greeks gifted us a blueprint for turning wounds into wisdom. The stage is set, let's begin. Long before actors took the stage in polished masks and flowing robes, Greek theater began as something far more primal, a raw, rhythmic outpouring of devotion. In the shadowy hills outside Athens, villagers would gather to honor Dionysius, their voices rising in chants that blurred the line between prayer and performance. These weren't mere celebrations, they were acts of survival. After years of war and upheaval, people needed a way to channel their collective anguish, to transform chaos into something sacred. The god of wine and ecstasy became their unlikely guide, offering not just escape but revelation. In the frenzy of dance and song, something extraordinary happened. Individual sorrows merged into a shared experience, and from that alchemy, theater was born. By the 6th century before the Common Era, these rituals had crystallized into something revolutionary. Thespes, a figure shrouded in legend, is said to have stepped away from the chorus and spoken alone, becoming the first actor. That simple act changed everything. Now, stories could unfold with clarity and purpose, holding up a mirror to the fractures in society. The great Dionysia, Athens' grandest festival, became the crucible where myth and reality collided. Picture the scene: tens of thousands gathered in the open-air theater, the scent of roasting meat and crushed herbs thick in the air as the chorus voices swelled. Here, the tale of a king's hubris or a soldier's betrayal wasn't just entertainment, it was a communal reckoning. What made these performances so potent was their duality. On one level, they transported audiences to distant battles and divine realms, yet beneath the spectacle lay urgent questions. How do we live with the consequences of violence? Can justice ever break the cycle of vengeance? Take the plays of Aeschylus, a veteran of the Persian wars. His works pulsed with the trauma of combat, yet they didn't glorify war, they dissected its cost. In The Persians, performed just 8 years after Athens' victory, the enemy wasn't vilified but humanized. The audience, many of whom had fought in those very battles, found themselves weeping for their foes. That was the genius of Greek theater. It forced a society to stare into the abyss of its own suffering and emerge with deeper understanding. The physical space of the theater itself became a kind of sanctuary. The semicircular design wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Every seat, from the marble benches of the elite to the wooden planks of the commoners, faced the same stage. For a few hours, social divisions dissolved as the entire city bore witness to the same truths. Even the masks, those hauntingly empty faces, served a purpose. By stripping away individual features, they turned characters into vessels. Every hero's triumph, every mother's lament became universal. When the chorus warned of the god's wrath or sang of lost homelands, it wasn't just a character's pain echoing through the amphitheater. It was the voice of the community, finally speaking its unspeakable grief aloud. This was no accident. The Greeks understood something we're only now rediscovering. Trauma festers in silence but heals in the light of shared story. Their plays were more than art. They were public rituals of remembrance, carefully structured to guide audiences through the stages of collective healing. The catharsis Aristotle described wasn't just emotional release, it was societal realignment. By the final scene, the chaos of human suffering had been given order, meaning, even beauty. And as the audience filed out into the twilight, they carried that transformation back into the streets, the agora, their homes. The war stories that once divided them had become, through the magic of theater, the very thing that bound them together. Aristotle's insight into catharsis wasn't just philosophical speculation. It was a lifeline for a society drowning in the aftermath of war. Imagine sitting in that amphitheater, the weight of recent battles still heavy on your shoulders as the actor playing Agamemnon collapses under the weight of his own hubris. Your grief, your rage, your unspoken terror suddenly find a voice in his downfall. That's the alchemy of catharsis. It takes the chaos of personal suffering and gives it shape, turning what was once unbearable into something you can hold, examine, and finally release. The Greeks didn't just stumble upon this idea, they engineered it. Every aspect of their tragedies, from the relentless pacing of the plot to the haunting repetitions of the chorus, was designed to guide the audience through an emotional journey, like a surgeon carefully draining a wound. Modern psychology confirms what the Greeks intuited. Therapists now use techniques like narrative exposure therapy, where trauma survivors retell their stories in safe spaces, often with startlingly similar results. The brain, it turns out, processes lived and witnessed experiences in overlapping ways. When a veteran watches Philoctetes scream in agony over his festering wound, something remarkable happens. Their own pain becomes less isolating. This isn't escapism, it's mirroring. The stage becomes a controlled environment where emotions too dangerous to confront directly can be experienced at a remove, like handling fire through thick glass. Yet Greek theater went even further than modern therapy in one crucial way. It made healing a communal act. Today's trauma treatments often happen behind closed doors, but in Athens, catharsis was a public ritual. When the chorus in The Trojan Women mourned the children of a fallen city, the entire audience mourned with them, not just for fictional characters, but for their own lost sons and brothers. This collective dimension was vital. Trauma fractures communities, isolating individuals in their suffering. Greek drama stitched them back together by saying, "Your pain is not yours alone." The shared tears in that amphitheater were as important as the play itself, a silent agreement that no one would bear their grief in solitude. The brilliance of this system lay in its subtlety. Unlike modern war memorials that often glorify sacrifice, Greek tragedies confronted the messy, morally ambiguous reality of conflict. Take Sophocles' Ajax, where the titular hero, a revered warrior, descends into madness and shame after being denied honor. Here was no sanitized hero's tale, but a raw portrait of psychological collapse. Audiences who had idolized such warriors now saw their fragility, and in doing so, found permission to acknowledge their own. This was catharsis at its most potent, not just emotional release, but a radical reordering of understanding. By the play's end, the audience hadn't just wept for Ajax, they'd glimpsed the humanity in every broken soldier, including themselves. What makes this ancient approach so startlingly relevant is its recognition that healing isn't about forgetting, it's about reframing. The Greeks didn't use theater to erase the scars of war. They used it to integrate those scars into their collective identity. When we watch a character like Orsts, haunted by the Furies after avenging his father, we're seeing a society grapple with the inescapable consequences of violence. The resolution doesn't come from absolution, but from acceptance. The Furies don't disappear, they're transformed into the humanoids, the kindly ones. In that metamorphosis lies a profound lesson. Trauma doesn't vanish, but its power to control us can shift when we dare to bring it into the light, to name it, to share it. That's the real magic of catharsis, not purging our darkest emotions, but learning to carry them together. Consider the audacity of staging the Persians in Athens just 8 years after their victory over Persia. Here was a play that dared to center the enemy's grief, to humanize those their own soldiers had fought. Aeschylus, who had himself stood in the battle lines at Marathon and Salamis, didn't craft a triumphant spectacle. Instead, he showed weeping Persian mothers, a shattered king, and the hollow cost of conquest forces his audience had recently celebrated defeating. This wasn't just bold storytelling, it was psychological alchemy. By dramatizing their foes' suffering, the playwright performed an extraordinary act of emotional surgery on his city. The very people who had hurled spears at Persians now sat breathless as actors gave voice to their enemies' mourning. What made this approach so revolutionary was its rejection of simplistic narratives. Greek tragedies refused to paint war as a clean dichotomy of heroes and villains. In The Trojan Women, Euripides showed victorious Greek soldiers committing atrocities just as horrific as those they'd avenged. Hecuba's lament for her fallen city wasn't merely poetic, it was a direct challenge to Athenian imperialism during the brutal Peloponnesian War. Audiences expecting patriotic fervor instead faced uncomfortable parallels between their own actions and the tragedies they'd long ascribed to mythical foes. The theater's power lay in this very discomfort. It disrupted the stories societies tell themselves to justify violence. The physical production amplified this effect. Unlike modern war films that overwhelm with sensory bombardment, Greek tragedies used stark, deliberate imagery. A single bloodied mask, the slow procession of the chorus, the echoing thud of a staff marking fate's relentless march. These minimalist elements focused attention on war's emotional aftermath rather than battle's adrenaline. When Clytemnestra appeared in Agamemnon with robes drenched in her husband's blood, the horror wasn't in the gore but in her chilling calm. The audience didn't need to see the murder, the weight of that fabric told them everything. Such restraint made the psychological impact more potent, allowing each spectator to project their own memories onto the symbolic violence. Perhaps most strikingly, These plays often centered voices typically silenced in wartime: mothers, prisoners, the enslaved. In The Suppliants, Aeschylus gave the chorus not to warriors but to refugee women pleading for sanctuary. Their songs of lost homes and scattered families resonated deeply with Athenians who knew the scars of displacement. By elevating these perspectives, theater became a counterweight to the official histories carved in stone. While monuments celebrated generals and victories, the stage preserved the whispers of those who paid war's price. This tradition holds an urgent lesson for our modern world, where contemporary media often reduces conflict to sound bites and statistics. Greek tragedy insisted on sitting with complexity. The playwrights understood that true healing begins when we stop otherizing the wounded, when we recognize that grief, like the chorus song, knows no borders. Their audiences didn't leave these performances with easy answers, but with something far more valuable: the courage to question, to mourn, and most radically, to see themselves in the eyes of those they'd called enemy. While tragedy carved a sacred space for collective mourning, comedy wielded a different kind of power: the sharp, disarming blade of laughter. Aristophanes, the master of ancient Greek comedy, understood something profound. Humor could expose the absurdities of war in ways solemn speeches never could. Take Lysistrata, where women from warring city-states unite to end conflict through the most unexpected of weapons, a sex strike. On the surface, it's outrageous farce, but beneath the bawdy jokes lies a radical critique of militarism. The play's genius wasn't just in its premise. It was in how laughter became a Trojan horse, smuggling uncomfortable truths past the defenses of a war-weary audience. When spectators roared at the sight of men hobbling around in comical agony, they were also glimpsing the ridiculousness of their own stubborn conflicts. This wasn't mere escapism. Greek comedy served as societal pressure valve, releasing tensions too volatile for direct confrontation. Where tragedies like The Trojan Women forced audiences to weep together, comedies like The Acharnians let them laugh at the very leaders perpetuating their suffering. Aristophanes mocked generals, politicians, and even the gods with impunity, his words protected by the ritual license of the Dionysian festival. The humor was subversive medicine. By reducing warmongers to figures of ridicule, it drained their power. Imagine the catharsis of watching a caricatured general trip over his own spear or a pompous politician get drenched in sewage. These weren't just jokes, they were acts of psychological rebellion, transforming fear and anger into collective release. The balance between tragedy and comedy created a yin-yang of healing. Tragedy honored pain's depth, comedy affirmed resilience. After days immersed in the weight of Oedipus Rex, audiences needed the levity of The Birds, where ordinary Athenians build a utopia in the clouds. This rhythm mirrored the natural oscillation of grief itself, moments of crushing sorrow giving way to fragile hope. The Greeks recognized that healing isn't linear. It requires both the sacred space to mourn and the irreverent freedom to laugh at life's absurdities. Even the physical staging reflected this duality. The same masks that conveyed Agamemnon's agony could, with a twist of the actor's body, become the exaggerated grimaces of a comic fool. What's remarkable is how these ancient insights align with modern trauma research. Psychologists now recognize humor as a coping mechanism that reduces stress hormones and builds social bonds, exactly what fractured communities needed post-war. The communal laughter in those amphitheaters did more than entertain. It rewired neural pathways, replacing isolation with connection. When the women of Lysistrata finally reconcile their husbands through playful seduction, the resolution isn't just political, it's neurological. Shared laughter triggers the release of endorphins, creating biological synchrony among strangers. The Greeks, in their wisdom, had stumbled upon a profound truth. sometimes the quickest path to peace isn't through solemn treaties, but through the unifying power of a well-timed joke. Yet Greek comedy's brilliance lay in its double edge. Even as it healed, it provoked. By framing war as not just tragic but ridiculous, it challenged audiences to question why they kept sacrificing their sons for abstract grudges. The laughter it inspired wasn't passive amusement, it was the spark of critical thinking. When an actor playing a Spartan and an Athenian drunkenly stumbled into friendship in Lysistrata, the message was clear. The divisions between them were as arbitrary as the wine stains on their tunics. This was humor as societal mirror, reflecting back the contradictions audiences had learned to ignore. And in that reflection lay the seeds of change, not delivered as a sermon, but as a punchline that lingered long after the applause faded. The chorus wasn't just a group of singers, it was the beating heart of Greek theater, a living bridge between the actors and the audience. Picture them moving in perfect unison, their voices rising and falling like waves, their bodies swaying to the rhythm of collective memory. These weren't performers in the modern sense, they were conduits for something far larger. When they sang of fallen heroes or cursed destinies, every word carried the weight of shared history, binding the audience together in a way no solo actor ever could. Their presence transformed personal tragedies into communal rites, reminding each spectator that their private grief was part of a greater tapestry. What made the chorus so powerful was its fluid identity. One moment, they might embody the elders of Thebes, shaking their heads at Oedipus's arrogance. The next, they could become the women of Troy, their keening cries echoing through the amphitheater as they clutched imaginary children to their chests. This chameleonic quality allowed them to hold multiple truths at once: judges and mourners, witnesses and participants. In a society fractured by war, the chorus became the glue, voicing perspectives often sidelined in victory narratives. When they questioned the morality of a general's decision or lamented the cost of conquest, they gave language to the doubts many citizens felt but dared not speak aloud. Their physical movements held meaning too. The synchronized steps, the circling formations, these weren't mere stagecraft but symbolic reenactments of societal healing. Like a dance around a campfire, their motions created order from chaos, turning raw emotion into something structured and bearable. The strophe and antistrophe, those mirrored movements where the chorus divided and responded to itself, mirrored the back and forth of collective grief. One group would sing of loss, the other would answer with memory, and in that call and response, pain began to transform. Modern audiences might find the chorus's role puzzling. Why interrupt the action with song? But the Greeks understood something we often forget. Trauma lodges not just in the mind but in the body. The chorus's rhythmic chanting, their stomping feet, even the way their breath synchronized, these weren't embellishments. They were somatic therapy long before the term existed. When soldiers fresh from battle heard 50 voices trembling together in a hymn for the dead, their own shaking hands might still for just a moment. The vibrations in the air became vibrations in the chest, a physical reminder they weren't alone. Perhaps most crucially, the chorus refused to let anyone off the hook. While main characters might rage against the gods or plead ignorance, the chorus stood as the unwavering voice of consequence. Their odes about divine justice or the fickleness of fortune weren't just poetic interludes, they were warnings, lessons, sometimes even accusations. In Antigone, when they sing of the dangers of pride moments before Creon's downfall, it's not foreshadowing, it's a direct challenge to every leader in the audience. Their words blurred the line between myth and reality, forcing spectators to ask, are we any wiser than these doomed kings? This collective voice did something extraordinary. It democratized empathy. The chorus might speak for enslaved women in one play, for enemy soldiers in another, stretching the audience's capacity to recognize humanity where they'd been taught to see none. In a world where war depended on dehumanizing the other, these songs became subtle acts of resistance. When the chorus wept for Hector's corpse or the pillaged women of Milos, they weren't just advancing the plot. They were rewiring hearts, one lament at a time. The genius of this ancient device echoes in surprising places today. From the call and response of gospel choirs to the haunting refrains in war memorials, we still turn to collective voice when words fail us. The Greeks knew that some truths are too heavy for solo speech. They require many mouths, many breaths, many hearts beating in time. The chorus didn't just accompany the drama. It made healing audible, giving form to the invisible threads that bind a broken community back together. When their final notes faded into the twilight, what lingered wasn't just melody, but the unshakable sense that no one should have to grieve alone. Myths weren't just stories to the Greeks, they were mirrors held up to the soul of a civilization. When audiences watched Oedipus blindly grope his way toward truth or Agamemnon sacrifice his daughter for ambition, they weren't merely witnessing drama. They were engaging with a sacred language of suffering, one that transformed personal anguish into something universal. These ancient tales functioned like psychological blueprints, offering a framework where chaos could be named, examined, and ultimately integrated. Imagine standing in that amphitheater as the actor playing Heracles collapses under the weight of his own madness, screaming to the heavens. Your private terrors suddenly had a vessel, a hero's fall that made your own struggles feel less like personal failures and more like threads in a grander tapestry. The genius of these myths lay in their refusal to offer easy answers. Unlike modern narratives that often tidy up trauma with neat resolutions, Greek legends embraced ambiguity. Take the story of Philoctetes, abandoned on an island for years with a festering wound. His pain wasn't erased when he was finally retrieved for war. It became part of his strength. This wasn't escapism, it was radical validation. For veterans in the audience still nursing invisible wounds, Philoctetes' tale affirmed what society often silenced. That healing isn't about returning to who you were before, but carrying your scars forward with purpose. Mythology's power sprang from its layers. On one level, these were thrilling tales of gods and monsters, but peel back the surface and they revealed startling psychological insights. The Furies haunting Orsts weren't just supernatural punishers, they embodied the relentless grip of guilt. Persephone's cyclical descent into the underworld mirrored the ebb and flow of grief. By externalizing inner demons as divine forces, the Greeks performed an extraordinary act of cognitive reframing. Trauma wasn't a private shame to suppress, it was a shared human experience as old as the gods themselves. This mythic framework even shaped how communities processed collective trauma. After the brutal Peloponnesian War, Euripides, the Trojan women, didn't celebrate Athenian victory, it staged the agony of the defeated. By framing recent suffering through the lens of Troy's fall, the play created critical distance. Audiences could weep for Hecuba without confronting fresh political wounds directly, allowing catharsis to sneak past defenses. The myth became a safe container, holding emotions too raw to address head-on. What's striking is how these ancient patterns align with modern therapeutic techniques. Today's trauma specialists use narrative therapy to help patients reframe their stories, much like Greek myths reframed suffering as part of a heroic journey. The concept of post-traumatic growth, the idea that struggle can lead to transformation, echoes in every hero's descent into the underworld and return. The Greeks understood something we're still learning. Healing begins when we stop seeing our pain as an aberration and start recognizing it as part of the human odyssey. Yet mythology offered something clinical therapy often struggles with: a sense of cosmic scale. When the chorus in Prometheus Bound sang of the Titan's eternal punishment, they weren't just describing one being's suffering. They were mapping the price of progress, the tension between rebellion and order. For audiences grappling with war's aftermath, this cosmic perspective was medicine. Individual losses became part of something vast and meaningful, like stars in an ancient constellation. The myths whispered a profound truth: your grief isn't small because the universe is large. It's sacred because it connects you to everything that ever was. This is why these stories endure. They don't just depict healing, they enact it. Every time an actor donned the mask of Oedipus or Antigone, they weren't merely retelling a tale. They were reopening a ritual space where pain could be witnessed, weighed, and woven into the collective memory. The Greeks didn't need therapists in white coats. They had the muses, the fates, and the chorus haunting refrains. And in that alchemy of art and archetype, they found what we still seek today: not an end to suffering, but a way to bear it together. When the dust settled after Athens' bitter civil conflicts, the city faced a challenge far beyond rebuilding its walls. It had to mend the fractures in its very soul. Enter the theater, not with grand speeches or forced apologies, but with stories that bypassed defenses and spoke directly to wounded hearts. Consider the opening scene of The Orsteia, where a watchman sighs with exhaustion after years of war. That single moment did more than set the stage. It gave voice to the collective fatigue of a divided people. Aeschylus' trilogy wasn't merely entertainment. It was societal surgery, carefully dissecting the cycle of vengeance that had torn Athens apart and offering a radical alternative: justice over retaliation, courts over blood feuds. This artistic intervention came at a pivotal moment. The city had just established its first democratic courts, shifting power from feuding families to impartial juries. The playwright mirrored this transition through Orst's trial, where the Furies' primal cries for vengeance gradually yield to Athena's reasoned verdict. Night after night, citizens watched this transformation unfold, internalizing its message through the most powerful teacher empathetic experience. Those who'd lost loved ones in the conflict now saw their rage personified in Clytemnestra, then witnessed its consequences in her son's torment. The genius lay in showing rather than telling. No politician could have persuaded Athenians to abandon generations of vendetta culture as effectively as those haunting final scenes where the Furies, once terrifying, become protectors of the new order. Beyond the grand tragedies, even comedy played its part in reconciliation. Aristophanes' The Frogs, staged during the Peloponnesian War's darkest days, featured Dionysius journeying to the underworld to bring back a poet who could save Athens. The outrageous premise masked a serious plea: stop fighting long enough to remember what united you. When the chorus declared, "It's shameful for men who have fought together to act like fools," laughter became the spoonful of sugar helping bitter medicine go down. The play's climax, where Aeschylus and Euripides debate which tragic style best serves the city, wasn't just literary criticism. It was a metaphor for Athens' urgent need to choose dialogue over destruction. These performances functioned as diplomatic backchannels when official avenues failed. After the oligarchic coup of 411, theaters became rare spaces where opposing factions sat shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same air, reacting to the same moments. The shared experience created what modern peacebuilders call contact theory, the idea that proximity and common goals reduce prejudice. When the chorus in Eumenides sang, "Let war be outside our borders forever," the line resonated differently for Democrats and oligarchs alike, planting seeds of unity in scorched earth. The physical production elements reinforced this message. Directors often cast actors from opposing political factions in the same play, forcing collaboration where none existed. The masks, those great equalizers, made it impossible to tell a former enemy from an ally backstage. Even the choreography held meaning, the circular movements of the chorus representing the cyclical nature of conflict, then gradually shifting into linear formations as order was restored. Every aspect conspired to model the society Athens could become. What makes this ancient approach so revolutionary is its acknowledgement that political wounds require emotional salve. Modern peace treaties focus on land swaps and power sharing, but the Greeks understood that true reconciliation needs stories, ones where former enemies recognize their shared humanity. When the austere Furies finally accept their new role as guardians of justice, their transformation isn't imposed but earned through patient persuasion. That slow, artful process of changing hearts before demanding changed behavior holds a lesson for every fractured society. Lasting peace begins not in Senate chambers, but in the collective imagination. And there, in the flickering torchlight of the theater of Dionysius, an entire city learned to imagine itself anew. The design of Greek theaters wasn't just about aesthetics, it was a masterclass in psychological architecture. Picture the steep, concentric rows of seats curving around the orchestra like a stone embrace, each tier ensuring that whether you were a wealthy statesman or a humble potter, your view was unobstructed, your voice equally heard. This wasn't democracy as an abstract ideal, it was democracy carved into limestone. The very shape of the amphitheater, a perfect semicircle, mirrored the communal spirit of healing. Unlike the rigid lines of modern auditoriums that isolate spectators in private boxes, Greek theaters forced everyone to face not just the stage, but each other. When the chorus lamented the fall of Troy, you didn't just hear the actors, you felt the collective gasp, saw the tears on your neighbor's face, and realized your grief wasn't yours alone. Acoustics played a role as vital as the script itself. Engineers designed these spaces so precisely that a whisper from the stage could reach the highest seats without amplification. Imagine the power of that. A veteran in the back row, still haunted by battle dreams, catching every shuddering breath of a character like Ajax as he unraveled. The sound wasn't just clear, it was intimate, as if the gods themselves had tuned the air to carry trauma's weight. Modern studies reveal that low-frequency vibrations, like those produced by chanting choruses, can reduce stress hormones. The Greeks may not have known the science, but they understood the effect. When the deep, resonant voices of the chorus filled the theater, they weren't just performing. They were recalibrating nervous systems, one resonant note at a time. Even the entrance rituals held meaning. Audiences didn't file in silently. They processed together, often after sacrifices to Dionysius. The act of moving en masse through the same gates, smelling the same incense, created a sensory bond before the play even began. By the time they took their seats, strangers had become fellow pilgrims on a shared emotional journey. The physicality mattered, the press of shoulders, the shared shade from the midday sun. In a world without therapists' couches, this was group therapy on a monumental scale. The orchestra's circular space at the center wasn't just a stage, it was a symbolic hearth. In Greek homes, the hearth was sacred, a place where families gathered for warmth and storytelling. By scaling this concept up to civic proportions, the theater became Athens' collective hearth. When actors moved within that circle, they weren't merely entertaining. They were reenacting the primal act of huddling around the fire to make sense of the dark. The altar to Dionysius at the orchestra's center reinforced this, turning every performance into a kind of secular sacrament. Perhaps most ingeniously, the design forced confrontation. There were no curtains, no dimmed lights to soften the blow of tragic revelations. The harsh Mediterranean sun illuminated every bloodied mask, every trembling hand. This was intentional. Healing required staring directly at the thing that hurt, no distractions, no escape. Yet the openness also offered safety. With thousands of witnesses surrounding you, it became permissible to weep, to gasp, to cheer. The architecture gave permission to feel deeply in a culture that prized stoicism. Modern trauma centers could learn from these ancient blueprints. Today's therapeutic spaces often isolate patients in sterile rooms, but the Greeks knew healing thrives in community. Their theaters were more than buildings, they were machines for empathy, engineered to turn isolation into connection, silence into chorus. Every carved seat, every calculated echo, whispered the same truth: no one should have to face their demons alone. And as the sun dipped below the stage, painting the stone in gold, audiences carried that lesson home, not just in their minds, but in their bones. While the spotlight of Greek theater shone on male actors and playwrights, women wove their own healing tapestry in the shadows, through rituals so potent they shaped the cultural fabric of Athens. The Thesmophoria, a festival forbidden to men, became their sacred stage. For 3 days each autumn, women gathered on the Phoenix Hill, the same space where men debated war, to perform rites as old as the earth itself. They fasted, told stories of Demeter's grief for her lost daughter Persephone, and buried offerings in pits symbolizing the womb of the earth. What seemed like fertility magic was, in truth, a clandestine therapy session. In a society that denied them public voice, these ceremonies allowed women to transmute personal sorrow into collective myth, just as the tragedies did for men in the theater of Dionysius. The parallels between women's rituals and formal theater were no accident. Both used symbolic actions to process trauma. Where actors donned masks to channel characters, the Thesmophoria participants handled figurines representing lost children or absent husbands. The festival's central act, retrieving decayed pig remains from underground chambers, mirrored tragedy's obsession with unearthing buried truths. Aristophanes even spoofed this in his comedy, The Thesmophoria, where men infiltrate the rites, revealing how threatening female-led healing seemed to the patriarchal order. The joke masked a deeper truth. Women's private mourning rituals were the unseen foundation upon which public theater built its catharsis. These gatherings addressed wounds the polis ignored. While men processed war trauma through plays like The Persians, women used the Thesmophoria to grapple with the home front's silent casualties: the mothers who'd buried sons, the wives who welcomed home broken husbands, the daughters sold into marriage to replenish war-emptied coffers. Their chants to Demeter, goddess of both harvest and sorrow, acknowledged a brutal reality: soldiers weren't the only casualties of battle. The festival's timing spoke volumes. Held just before the sowing season, it framed grief as necessary fertilizer for new growth. This wasn't escapism, it was alchemy, turning private pain into communal resilience. The most radical aspect of these rites was their subversion of gender roles. In a culture that prized female silence, the Thesmophoria granted women license to curse, jest, and even symbolically castrate effigies of unfaithful men. Such acts, safely contained within ritual, provided psychological release valves. Modern trauma studies recognize this as symbolic enactment, a way to process powerlessness through controlled rebellion. When these women later sat in theater audiences watching Clytemnestra's vengeance or Antigone's defiance, they weren't just passive spectators. They'd already rehearsed resistance in their own sacred spaces. What makes this hidden history so vital is its reminder that healing isn't monolithic. While Greek men purified war's stains through the structured catharsis of tragedy, women forged their own path, one that embraced cyclical renewal over linear resolution. Their rituals lacked the tidy endings of Athenian drama, instead mirroring Demeter's eternal cycle of loss and return. This distinction speaks volumes. Where male-centered theater sought to purge trauma, women's traditions taught endurance through it. The quiet persistence of these practices, some surviving into Roman times, proves their power. Long after the great playwrights faded, the women of Greece kept whispering their stories to the earth, stitching wounds with threads of myth and memory. The true legacy of these rituals lies in their duality. Though excluded from the official stage, women influenced theater's evolution through osmosis. Playwrights borrowed themes from their rites. The mourning chorus in The Libation Bearers echoes the Smophoria's dirges. More profoundly, these parallel traditions reveal a universal truth: trauma demands multiple languages. Sometimes it needs the grandeur of masked actors under open skies. Other times it requires the intimacy of whispers in torchlit caves. The Greeks, in their wisdom, made space for both, not as rivals, but as complementary strands in the braid of collective healing. When modern audiences seek solace in art, they walk paths first laid by those ancient women, proving that even the silenced find ways to make their pain sing. The masks of Greek theater weren't mere props, they were portals to the soul. Carved from lightweight wood or stiffened linen, these exaggerated faces with their gaping mouths and hollow eyes did more than project an actor's voice. They transformed performers into vessels for emotions too vast for any single person to contain. Imagine standing in the amphitheater as the mask of Agamemnon tilted toward the sun, its painted features frozen in a scream. That unchanging expression became a canvas onto which every spectator projected their own anguish. The mask's rigidity was its genius, unlike a living face that might soften with empathy. It held relentless focus on the character's torment, forcing the audience to sit with discomfort rather than seek solace in the actor's humanity. This psychological distance served a profound purpose. For veterans haunted by battlefield horrors, watching a masked Heracles descend into madness was bearable in ways a bare-faced performance wouldn't be. The artifice created a safety net. This wasn't a real man unraveling, but a symbol of unraveling. Modern therapists call this defensive dissociation, the mind's ability to process trauma through symbolic representation. The masks functioned like emotional filters, straining raw pain into something the audience could metabolize. When the chorus leader lifted a mask depicting a grieving mother, spectators didn't see an individual's sorrow. They saw sorrow itself, elevated to mythic scale. Yet masks also empowered the actors. To don the visage of Oedipus was to borrow his tragic grandeur while remaining shielded from his fate. Thespians could channel unbearable emotions, a mother's wrath, a soldier's despair, without being consumed by them. This duality mirrored the Greek approach to wartime memory. Citizens could revisit their collective pain without being re-traumatized, because the stories wore the masks of legend rather than recent history. The masks' exaggerated features, the furrowed brows, the downturned mouths, acted like emotional magnifying glasses, amplifying subtle feelings into unmistakable statements. Archaeologists have found masks with interchangeable expressions, suggesting some productions used transformative reveals. A single actor might play both conqueror and conquered by flipping their mask, visually reinforcing war's fluid morality. The physical weight mattered too. Actors reported feeling the mask's presence as a tangible boundary between themselves and their roles, much like soldiers describe war as an identity worn temporarily. When the performance ended and the masks came off, it signaled a return to ordinary life, a ritualized transition modern veterans might recognize from hanging up a uniform. The mask's most subversive quality was their democratization of trauma. Elite or poor, young or old, every spectator projected their experiences onto those neutral, oversized features. A wealthy merchant and a battle-scarred farmer watching the same masked Ajax might see entirely different struggles reflected back. This was theater as communal Rorschach test, where collective wounds found expression without requiring words. Even the materials whispered symbolism: linen from the earth, paint from crushed minerals, all temporary yet enduring like memory itself. What modern audiences often miss is how these masks refused catharsis through simple resolution. Their static expressions never softened with forgiveness or brightened with happy endings. They demanded witnesses sit in the uncomfortable truth that some pains don't fade, they must be integrated. When the lights faded and the last mask was stored away, spectators carried not solutions, but a deepened capacity to hold life's complexities. In this way, the masks became more than tools of performance. They were teachers of the hardest lesson, that healing begins when we stop hiding from our ghosts and instead invite them to speak through us. Festivals like the city Dionysia turned the entire polis into a living organism of collective healing. Imagine Athens in spring, the scent of olive blossoms mixing with the tang of sacrificial wine, as citizens streamed toward the theater, not as individuals, but as limbs of one body. For 5 days, the city's heartbeat slowed to the rhythm of the chorus, its wounds laid bare under the open sky. This wasn't escapism, it was society holding its own pulse, measuring the distance between trauma and recovery through the precise intervals of dramatic competitions. The festival's rigid structure, 3 days of tragedies, 1 of satire plays, a final day of comedies, created a ritual container sturdy enough to hold the chaos of human suffering. The genius lay in repetition. Unlike modern theater where each performance stands alone, the Dionysia recurred annually like a returning tide. Veterans who'd flinched at sudden noises in the agora could mark their calendars knowing that come Elaphebolion, the 11th month, they'd sit again among thousands to witness their pain given form and meaning. This predictability was revolutionary in a world where war arrived like summer storms without warning, leaving shattered lives in its wake. The festival's cyclical nature taught a radical lesson. Healing isn't a destination, but a practice as regular as the seasons. Every element conspired to reinforce this therapeutic framework. Before the first actor spoke, priests led processions bearing Dionysus' effigy through the streets, retracing the god's mythical journey from outsider to honored deity. The symbolism wasn't subtle. This was Athens reenacting its own capacity to transform alienation into belonging. Then came the sacrifices, the communal feasts, the pouring of libations. These weren't pre-show entertainments, but vital steps in preparing the communal psyche for catharsis. Modern trauma specialists recognize such rituals as grounding techniques, ways to anchor participants safely in the present before revisiting painful memories. The competitive aspect added another layer of healing. Playwrights didn't just present finished works, they battled for the city's approval, their tragedies wrestling with fresh wounds. When Phrynichus staged the sack of Miletus, mere years after Athens' failed defense of the Ionian city, the raw pain proved too much. The audience wept uncontrollably, the playwright was fined and the play banned. Yet within decades, Aeschylus would win first prize with the Persians, proving the city had developed the emotional vocabulary to process similar trauma. The festivals became a barometer of collective resilience, measuring how far Athens had come in metabolizing its pain. Even the financing model served therapeutic ends. Wealthy citizens funded productions as a civic duty, their names announced to applause before each performance. This public-private partnership did more than fund art. It visibly demonstrated that healing was everyone's responsibility. When a chorus of grieving Trojan women sang their lament, the audience didn't just hear characters. They saw the tangible result of their neighbors' patronage, making empathy a communal investment. The true power of these festivals emerged in their aftermath. As spectators streamed back into the agora, the play's echoes lingered in their debates, their court cases, even their household conversations. The stories became shared reference points when two citizens argued over whether Athens should invade Sicily. They didn't cite political theory. They invoked the ghost of Agamemnon or the folly of Pentheus. The festival's gift wasn't temporary catharsis, but a permanent expansion of the civic imagination. Wars would still come, atrocities would still occur, but now there existed a sacred space where the unspeakable could be spoken, where the unbearable became, if not lighter, at least survivable when carried together. What modern society might learn from this ancient practice isn't the specifics. We needn't resurrect goat sacrifices, but the underlying principle that healing trauma requires more than individual therapy sessions. It demands communal rhythms, shared narratives, and the courage to make space for collective grief in the very heart of civic life. The Greeks didn't just attend the Dionysia, they consecrated it, carving into their calendar the radical notion that a city's health could be measured not by its military victories, but by its capacity to weep together under the spring sun. Foreign characters in Greek drama didn't just walk onto the stage, they shattered expectations. Take the Persian Queen Atossa in Aeschylus' play, stepping from her chariot not as a caricatured foe, but as a grieving mother trembling with prophetic dreams of her son's defeat. For Athenian audiences fresh from repelling Xerxes' invasion, this was revolutionary storytelling. The very people they'd feared as monstrous invaders now stood before them, speaking verses that echoed their own wartime terrors. These weren't simplistic villains, they were mirrors reflecting shared humanity back at a society steeped in victory's pride. Euripides took this further with plays like The Trojan Women, where the conquered became the emotional core. His Hecuba wasn't just a symbol of fallen Troy, she was every mother who'd cradled a broken child, every widow who'd watched her city burn. By giving Trojan women longer speeches than their Greek captors, the playwright forced his compatriots to sit with the consequences of their triumphs. The genius lay in timing. These plays often debuted during wartime when hatred ran hottest. Staging enemy suffering as the moral center wasn't just bold, it was psychological disarmament, softening the us versus them mentality that fuels endless conflict. Even comedies weaponized empathy. Aristophanes' The Acharnians featured a Megarian farmer so destitute he tries to sell his daughters as pigs, a jab at the economic toll of Athens' trade embargoes. The scene's absurdity masked its brilliance. By reducing geopolitical strife to one hungry man's desperation, it made abstract enemies relatable. Laughter became the Trojan horse smuggling compassion past audience defenses. Theater's power to reshape perception extended beyond Greeks and Persians. Sophocles' Philoctetes centered a Greek hero abandoned by his own army, his festering wound making him as much an outsider as any foreigner. The play's climax, where young Neoptolemus wrestles with betraying this outcast, mirrored Athens' own moral crossroads. Could they build an empire without becoming the tyrants they'd fought? By framing ethical dilemmas through marginalized perspectives, playwrights turned the stage into a gymnasium for conscience, training citizens to think beyond tribal loyalties. This narrative courage didn't emerge in a vacuum. Athens' growing empire meant daily contact with diverse cultures, from Egyptian merchants to Scythian archers policing their streets. The theater absorbed these influences, blending foreign myths into its repertoire and casting non-Greek characters with unprecedented nuance. When Dionysius in The Bacchae arrives from Asia wearing flowing silks, his exoticism isn't mocked but revered, a daring choice during the Peloponnesian War when Eastern influences were viewed with suspicion. The lasting impact of this approach whispers through history. Modern studies show that humanizing narratives reduce prejudice more effectively than factual arguments, something the Greeks intuited millennia ago. Their plays didn't just preach tolerance, they engineered it through visceral experience. An audience that had cheered Persian defeats in the agora might now weep for Atossa in the amphitheater, their hatred unraveling thread by thread. This was reconciliation not through edict, but through the slow alchemy of shared story, a proof that sometimes the most radical peacemaking begins when someone steps onto a stage, dons a stranger's mask, and speaks with the enemy's voice. The air in the ancient theater thrummed with more than words. It pulsed with the heartbeat of drums, the wail of Orlo's pipes, the scrape of sandaled feet against stone. Greek drama wasn't something you merely watched. It was something you felt in your ribs, your fingertips, the soles of your feet. When the chorus moved in perfect unison, their stomping rhythms weren't just accompaniment, they were seismic waves rearranging the emotional landscape of everyone present. This was healing orchestrated on a cellular level, where melody and motion became the unsung healers of war's invisible wounds. Consider the aulos, that double reed instrument whose haunting tones accompanied tragic moments. Its piercing sound wasn't chosen by accident. Modern studies reveal that woodwind timbres activate the amygdala, the brain's emotional processing center, more intensely than other instruments. The Greeks may not have had fMRI machines, but they understood instinctively what science now confirms. Certain frequencies bypass rational thought and speak directly to the body's memory of trauma. When the aulos lamented alongside Electra's grief or Orst's torment, it wasn't just setting the mood, it was giving sound to the wordless scream lodged in every veteran's throat, the collective wail of mothers who'd lost sons. Dance, too, was medicine disguised as art. The chorus synchronized steps, strophe and antistrophe, turning and responding created patterns as precise as a loom's weave. Their movements mirrored the brain's own bilateral stimulation, the left-right rhythm now used in EMDR therapy to reprocess traumatic memories. Victims of war, whether soldiers or survivors, often describe feeling stuck in their experiences. The chorus' repetitive, swaying motions offered a corrective, a physical manifestation of forward momentum, of chaos reshaped into order. To watch 50 bodies move as one was to witness the possibility of shattered individuals becoming whole again, if only for the span of a song. The power of this multisensory approach lay in its inclusivity. Not everyone in Athens could read philosophical treatises on trauma, but anyone, whether a battle-hardened hoplite or an illiterate farmer, could understand the language of a drum's crescendo building toward catharsis. Music and dance transcended class, education, even language barriers. When the chorus chanted in dactylic hexameter, the meter of epic poetry, they weren't just reciting verses. They were invoking centuries of shared cultural memory, aligning individual pulses with the collective heartbeat of myth. The vibrations in the air became vibrations in the body, a somatic reminder that no one grieves alone. Modern military hospitals use music therapy to help veterans with PTSD reconnect with suppressed emotions. The Greeks anticipated this by millennia. Their tragedies employed specific musical modes, the mixolydian for lamentation, the phrygian for ecstatic release, like a pharmacist dispensing targeted emotional tonics. The dithyramb, a wild choral dance honoring Dionysius, wasn't just performance, it was communal ecstasy, a way to exercise trauma through kinetic abandon. Imagine the relief for a soldier who'd spent years rigid with vigilance, finally surrendering to the drum's command, his body remembering how to move without fear. What's often overlooked is how these elements created emotional scaffolding. The music's predictable harmonies and the dance's repeating patterns provided structure, a container sturdy enough to hold the chaos of human suffering. Like a jazz musician leaning into dissonance before resolving to the tonic, Greek drama let audiences flirt with emotional freefall, then reeled them back to safety through rhythm and rhyme. This pendulum swing between tension and release trained the nervous system to navigate trauma's peaks and valleys. By the play's end, spectators hadn't just witnessed a story, they'd completed an emotional marathon, their bodies and minds synchronized in hard-won harmony. The true testament to this approach's power lies in its ripple effects. Long after the masks were stored and the chorus dispersed, the melodies lingered, hummed in olive groves tapped out on tavern tables. These weren't mere earworms, they were emotional touchstones, ready to be summoned when private grief overwhelmed. The dances, too, lived on in festival reenactments and village celebrations, their movements preserving collective memory long after living witnesses faded. In a world without recording devices or therapy manuals, music and dance became the living archives of healing, passed down not through scrolls but through swaying bodies and lifted voices. The Greeks knew what we often forget. Some wounds are too deep for words alone, but a song can reach where language fails. Oracles in Greek theater weren't just plot devices. They were psychological lifelines for a civilization battered by the whims of gods and men. Picture the scene. A king strides onto the stage, chest puffed with confidence, only to crumple as the oracle's words slit his certainty like a knife. These moments didn't just thrill audiences, they mirrored the brutal truth every Athenian knew too well, that no amount of strategy could shield them from fate's cruel turns. After decades of war, plague, and political upheaval, the Greeks didn't need reminding that life was fragile. What they craved was a way to make peace with that fragility, and the stage became their confessional. Take the infamous prophecy in Oedipus Rex, where a man's desperate attempts to outrun his destiny only tightened the noose. For veterans in the audience, this wasn't just drama, it was validation. Their own lives had taught them that courage and cunning weren't always enough. Sometimes the gods wrote tragedies long before the heroes took their first steps. By watching Oedipus' futile struggle, they weren't just witnessing his downfall, they were rehearsing surrender to forces beyond human control. The play's genius lay in its structure. The more Oedipus fought to uncover the truth, the faster he spiraled toward ruin. This wasn't nihilism, it was radical acceptance disguised as entertainment. Theater's portrayal of oracles offered something modern self-help books often miss: the permission to stop blaming oneself. When the chorus in Agamemnon sang of Zeus' inscrutable will, they gave voice to a society grappling with survivors' guilt. Why had some returned from war while others lay unburied on foreign soil? Why had plague spared one household and decimated another? The plays refused easy answers, instead offering a sacred space where uncertainty could be honored rather than solved. The oracle's ambiguous verses, deliberately slippery, open to endless interpretation, mirrored life's own refusal to conform to human logic. Euripides took this further with plays like Ion, where Apollo's prophecies twist into knots of irony. Here, characters don't just misinterpret oracles, they weaponize them, bending divine words to justify personal vendettas. For a society still reeling from civil wars sparked by competing visions of justice, this struck a nerve. The stage became a courtroom where fate itself stood trial, revealing how easily absolute certainty could become tyranny's mask. By exposing prophecy's malleability, Euripides didn't undermine faith, he deepened it, suggesting that true wisdom lay in holding predictions lightly, like candles in a windstorm. What makes this ancient approach so startlingly modern is its rejection of false comfort. Unlike today's algorithms promising to predict everything from weather to wars, Greek theater leaned into the discomfort of not knowing. The chorus refrain in Antigone, "No mortal can see what the gods have in store," wasn't passive resignation. It was an anthem for resilience, acknowledging that the only real control lay in how one faced the unpredictable. For soldiers who'd survived battles where a single stray arrow could rewrite destinies, this wasn't philosophy, it was lived truth. The physical staging reinforced this lesson. Oracles often appeared high above the actors on the theologian, a platform reserved for deities. Their voices would boom downward, literally towering over human concerns. Yet the play's true revelations rarely came from these pronouncements. They emerged in the quiet aftermath, as characters grappled with shattered illusions. The real oracle wasn't the priestess at Delphi. It was the empty space between expectation and reality where growth began. This tradition holds urgent wisdom for our age of endless forecasts and risk assessments. Where we seek certainty through data, the Greeks forged strength by staring into the void. Their plays taught that healing begins not when we master life's chaos, but when we stop demanding mastery at all. As the masked actor playing Oedipus groped blindly toward acceptance, thousands in the amphitheater groped with him not toward answers, but toward the courage to live the questions. Hubris wasn't just a character flaw in Greek tragedy, it was a civic emergency. When Creon in Antigone barks his infamous decree forbidding Poloneice's burial, the audience didn't merely witness a king's mistake. They saw the anatomy of disaster unfolding in real time. His refusal to bend, even as the chorus pleads and prophets warn, mirrors the blind obstinacy that had led Athens into countless avoidable wars. The brilliance of Sophocles' writing lies in how Creon's downfall isn't framed as some divine lightning strike, but as the inevitable result of human arrogance left unchecked. Every step, from his dismissal of Antigone's piety to his sneering at Teresia's wisdom, tightens the noose around his own neck, showing how power divorced from humility becomes a weapon turned inward. This theatrical caution had razor-sharp relevance for Athenian society. Recent veterans watching Antigone would recall real-life commanders who'd marched troops into hopeless battles rather than lose face. The play's climax, where Creon loses both son and wife in rapid succession, wasn't just tragic, it was instructional. By externalizing the psychological costs of hubris, Sophocles gave his audience an emotional calculator. Here's the interest accrued when leaders prioritize pride over people. The chorus final lines, "The mighty words of the proud are paid in full with mighty blows of fate," landed like a hammer on an anvil, forging collective memory that outlasted any wartime speech. Euripides amplified this warning in the Bacchae, where Pentheus' refusal to acknowledge Dionysius' divinity leads to his gruesome dismemberment. The staging itself taught the lesson. Pentheus literally climbs higher and higher on the stage machinery to spy on the Maenads, his physical elevation mirroring his moral descent. For a culture that had recently watched politicians gamble with lives in the Peloponnesian War, the metaphor burned bright. Leaders who place themselves above divine and natural laws become architects of their people's suffering. What makes these narratives so enduring is their rejection of simple villainy. Creon isn't some cartoonish tyrant. He's painfully human, a man who genuinely believes he's protecting civic order. That complexity forced Athenian audiences to confront their own complicities. When the chorus murmurs, "Stubbornness brands you for stupidity," the line ricocheted beyond the stage, challenging every citizen who'd ever cheered a demagogue's fiery speech or turned a blind eye to diplomatic folly. The theater became a communal examination of conscience, where the price of hubris wasn't abstract political theory, but a mother's wails over her dead children. Modern leaders might benefit from this ancient mirror. Where contemporary politics often rewards doubling down, Greek tragedy showed the wisdom of course correction. In Ajax, the hero's inability to adapt after losing Achilles' armor leads to his spiral into madness and suicide. His famous deception speech, where he appears to reconcile with his enemies only to later take his life, lays bare the danger of honor cultures that leave no room for graceful retreat. The audience witnesses how rigidity, even when wrapped in noble ideals, breeds destruction. The true power of these cautionary tales lay in their timing. Playwrights often debuted such works during wartime, when the message carried mortal stakes. Aeschylus' Seven against Thebes, performed while Athens battled Sparta, showed how sibling rivalry could escalate into city-annihilating strife. By framing current conflicts through legendary disasters, the plays allowed citizens to question policies without outright treason. The masks and meters provided just enough distance to make the medicine palatable, a lesson modern societies might ponder when confronting uncomfortable truths about their own wartime choices. These ancient warnings echo across millennia, not because human nature has changed, but because it hasn't. The same pride that toppled Creon still fuels needless conflicts today. The same refusal to lose face that doomed Pentheus still paralyzes peace processes. Greek tragedy's genius was in making the abstract tangible, turning political hubris from a concept into corpses on stage, ensuring no spectator could mistake its cost. When the actors took their bows, the applause wasn't just for the performance, but for the survival of a city that had chosen, for another day, to learn from fiction rather than repeat it in fact. Just when the weight of tragedy threatened to crush the spirit, the Greeks unleashed their secret weapon, satire plays, those bawdy, irreverent bursts of joy that followed the solemn trilogies like champagne after a funeral. Imagine the scene, after hours spent wrestling with Aust's guilt or Antigone's defiance. The same actors who'd portrayed kings and heroes now pranced onto the stage with horsetails swinging and oversized phalluses bobbing, their masks twisted into leering grins. This wasn't just comic relief, it was psychological judo, flipping despair into delight with the precision of masters who understood that healing isn't a straight line, but a dance between shadow and light. The satire play's magic lay in its audacious timing. Unlike modern theater that separates comedy and tragedy into distinct genres, the Greeks deliberately sandwiched them together, forcing audiences to traverse the full spectrum of human emotion in a single sitting. After the relentless tension of the Orsteia, where blood feud gives way to courtroom justice, spectators weren't sent home to brood. Instead, they were treated to Proteus, a raucous parody where Menelaus wrestles with the shape-shifting sea god while a chorus of satyrs, those half-goat, half-man mischief-makers, comically misinterpret every solemn moment. The tonal whiplash was intentional, like a cultural ice bath shocking the system back to life. These plays weren't mere clown shows, though. Beneath the phallic gags and drunken antics lay sophisticated commentary. Take Euripides' Cyclops, where Odysseus' encounter with Polyphemus becomes a tavern brawl, the monster transformed into a brutish drunk heckling the satyr chorus. By reducing epic suffering to barroom farce, the playwright performed a sly trick. He showed trauma's hold could be loosened through laughter. Veterans who'd stiffened at mentions of Cyclops' cave now found themselves guffawing at the monster's hangover, their battlefield memories momentarily disarmed. The satyrs themselves were perfect healers, creatures of Dionysius who embodied life's untamable urges. Where tragic choruses represented communal wisdom, the satyr chorus reveled in ID, their unfiltered lust and gluttony serving as antidotes to wartime austerity. Their costumes told the whole story: furry animal hides instead of dignified robes, crude padding exaggerating bellies and buttocks, everything designed to celebrate the body's messy vitality. In a society that prized discipline and decorum, these plays gave license to the parts of the soul that refused to be civilized, recognizing that survival sometimes demands not solemnity, but belly laughs. Modern psychology confirms the Greeks' intuition. Studies show that laughter triggers endorphin release, lowers stress hormones, and even temporarily relieves pain effects desperately needed by societies rebuilding after conflict. The satyr play's crude humor served as social defibrillators, jolting communities back to life after tragedy's numbing blow. Their ritualized absurdity, whether satyrs mistaking wineskins for babies or gods getting tangled in their own robes, created what anthropologists call liminal space, where normal rules suspend and healing can begin. What's most striking is how these plays preserve dignity even in mockery. Unlike modern parody that often diminishes its targets, satyr dramas treated myths with affectionate irreverence. Heracles might stumble drunk into a brothel, but his heroism wasn't erased, it was humanized. This balance held profound therapeutic value. By allowing audiences to laugh at their sacred stories, the plays prevented myth from hardening into unapproachable dogma. Trauma thrives in rigidity. The satyr's anarchic spirit kept cultural memory flexible enough to endure. The genius of this tradition whispers through the ages. From Shakespeare's gravediggers to modern veterans' stand-up comedy groups, we still instinctively seek laughter after loss. The Greeks simply institutionalized this wisdom, baking it into their most sacred artistic rituals. Their satyr plays remind us that resilience isn't about stoicism alone. It's the ability to weep for Hector at dawn and chuckle at a satyr's antics by noon, to hold both the weight of the world and the lightness of being in the same battered hands. The Athenian military did something that would baffle modern generals. They sent recruits not just to boot camps, but to the theater. Imagine young hoplites fresh from their drills, their muscles still aching from spear practice, now seated in the Dionysian amphitheater watching Agamemnon's homecoming turn to bloodshed. This wasn't cultural enrichment, it was psychological conditioning of the most sophisticated kind. While today's armies use simulations and stress inoculation training, the Greeks weaponized tragedy to prepare soldiers for war's invisible wounds before they ever set foot on a battlefield. The logic was brutally elegant. By exposing warriors in training to the full emotional spectrum of conflict, the grief of Trojan mothers, the madness of Ajax, the hollow triumph of blood-soaked victors, the city-state forged resilience through art. These plays functioned like emotional fire drills, rehearsing trauma in the safety of peacetime so that when real combat came, the shock would be familiar, manageable. Modern psychologists call this stress exposure therapy, but the Greeks understood it instinctively. They knew that men who had wept for Hector's corpse in the theater would be less likely to unravel when they saw their first comrade fall in battle. The stage became a kind of dress rehearsal for the soul. Consider the sheer audacity of staging The Persians, a play humanizing Athens' recent enemies for soldiers who might soon face those same foes again. This wasn't just about cultivating empathy, it was about preventing the dehumanization that makes atrocities possible. When a young soldier watched Xerxes' mother mourn her son's defeat, he wasn't just seeing an enemy queen, he was glimpsing the universal cost of war. The generals understood that the most dangerous warrior isn't the one numbed to suffering, but the one who recognizes its weight without being crushed by it. The training's brilliance lay in its subtlety. Unlike modern desensitization drills that blunt emotions, Greek theater amplified them in controlled bursts. Recruits didn't just witness Hecuba's lament, they heard it sung by a chorus of 50 voices, felt the vibrations in their chests as drums underscored every loss. This multisensory approach created what neurologists now term embodied cognition. The plays didn't just describe trauma, they let soldiers experience it somatically, building neural pathways to process future shocks. When these men later faced real screams on battlefields, their bodies remembered the rhythms of catharsis. Yet the plays also served as cautionary tales about leadership. Sophocles' Philoctetes, with its portrayal of a hero abandoned by his comrades, was required viewing for officer candidates. The message was clear: tactical brilliance means nothing without loyalty to your men. Ajax's suicidal rage in the face of dishonor served as a grim lesson in emotional regulation, a warning that the same passion-fueling courage could also destroy it. These weren't abstract morals, they were survival skills disguised as drama, teaching future commanders that war's greatest threats often come from within. The paradox at the heart of this practice reveals the Greeks' profound understanding of combat psychology. By forcing soldiers to confront war's emotional devastation before experiencing it, they didn't create weaker warriors, they forged more resilient ones. A hoplite who had trembled with Orst's guilt or shuddered at Clytemnestra's vengeance brought something priceless to the battlefield: the capacity to endure horror without losing his humanity. In an era when most armies sought to harden their troops through brutality, Athens chose the radical path of emotional vaccination, inoculating their fighters with carefully measured doses of artistic anguish so they might survive the real thing intact. This ancient wisdom finds eerie echoes in contemporary military practices. The U.S. Marines now incorporate Shakespeare's Henry V into officer training, while modern veterans write plays about their experiences to process trauma. What the Greeks grasped millennia ago, science is now confirming. Stories don't just entertain, they rewire us. The amphitheater was their laboratory, the plays their psychological armor, proving that sometimes the surest shield against destruction isn't steel, but a well-told tale that prepares the heart for what the body must endure. Exile cuts deeper than any sword, a truth the Greeks knew all too well. When the chorus in Euripides, the Trojan women, cried out for their pillaged city, their lament wasn't just poetic theater, it was a lifeline thrown to every displaced soul in the audience. These plays about wandering heroes and broken homecomings did something revolutionary. They turned the private shame of displacement into a shared civic experience. Picture a veteran back from decades of war, his childhood home now occupied by strangers, watching Odysseus struggle to reclaim Ithaca. Suddenly, his alienation wasn't a personal failure. It was part of an ancient story, worthy of the stage and the gods' attention. The adaptations of the Odyssey performed in Athenian theaters weren't mere entertainment. They were reintegration manuals disguised as myth. When audiences saw Odysseus mocked as a beggar in his own hall, only to slowly reveal his true identity, they witnessed the perfect metaphor for veterans' return. War changes a person in ways that aren't always visible. The way they flinch at sudden noises, the hollow look in their eyes. The plays validated these invisible transformations, showing that homecoming isn't about slipping back into an old life, but negotiating a new one. The recognition scenes where Odysseus is finally acknowledged by his nurse through a scar or his wife through a weaving trick mirrored the real struggles of soldiers proving their identities to families who'd moved on without them. Euripides took this further with Andromache, where the Trojan princess becomes a slave in her conqueror's house. Her monologues about phantom limbs, aching for a child and husband lost in war, gave voice to refugees flooding Athens after the Peloponnesian conflicts. The brilliance lay in making the enemy's grief universally relatable. Wealthy citizens who'd never missed a meal found themselves weeping for a foreign widow's hunger, her descriptions of clutching her son's ashes echoing the urns they'd seen carried through their own streets. This was empathy engineered at scale by framing displacement through legendary figures. Playwrights dissolved the stigma around real-world suffering. The physical staging reinforced these themes. Actors playing exiles often entered from the skene side doors, the same entrances used for foreign characters, visually linking displacement with otherness. Yet as the plays progressed, these outsiders would move center stage, their anguish demanding the city's full attention. The masks helped too. A refugee's exaggerated sorrow carved into wood made private grief impossible to ignore. When the chorus in The Suppliants stretched their hands toward the audience, begging for sanctuary, the gesture blurred the line between performance and reality. Many spectators had faced those same outstretched hands at Athens' gates. What modern societies diagnose as PTSD symptoms: hypervigilance, emotional numbness, Greek theater framed as the natural consequences of rupture. Odysseus' inability to sleep in his own bed wasn't weakness. It was the logical result of 20 years at war. By externalizing these struggles through myth, the plays created a shared language for experiences too raw to describe directly. Veterans could point to Agamemnon's bath scene where his weariness of home mirrors their own and say, that's what I feel, no explanations needed. The homecoming narratives held particular power for colonies and occupied territories. When Athenian settlers watched the Odyssey in Sicily or Thrace, they weren't just seeing a hero's journey, they were seeing their own tensions reflected back. Should they cling to Athenian customs or adapt to new lands? Was Penelope's loyalty to Ithaca noble or stubborn? The plays became a safe space to wrestle with hybrid identities. Even the comic versions, like Aristophanes' send-ups of Odysseus' wanderings, served a purpose. Laughter loosened the grip of trauma, making assimilation feel less like betrayal. This ancient approach holds urgent lessons for today's refugee crises, where modern integration programs often focus on language and job skills. Greek theater addressed the soul's disorientation. It acknowledged that home isn't just a place but a story, one that must be rewritten after war's erasures. When the chorus in The Phoenician Women sang, "No one is foreign in the house of grief," they offered something more practical than sympathy, a blueprint for belonging built on shared loss. The plays didn't promise happy endings, only this, that no one should have to navigate exile alone again. Gods descending on mechanical cranes weren't just theatrical spectacle, they were psychological lifelines for a society drowning in unanswerable questions. When Athena swooped down in the Eumenides to halt the cycle of vengeance between Orsts and the Furies, her divine intervention did more than resolve the plot. It modeled surrender to forces beyond human control. For Athenians torn apart by generational blood feuds, this wasn't a cop-out ending. It was permission to stop demanding tidy resolutions to messy wounds. The Deus Ex Machina became theater's way of saying some knots can't be untangled, only cut by higher hands. Euripides mastered this spiritual sleight of hand in plays like the Bacchae, where Dionysius' brutal arrival forces Thebes to acknowledge his divinity. The god's violence isn't random, it's corrective, answering mortal arrogance with divine order restored. Audiences who'd survived plague outbreaks and naval disasters recognized the uncomfortable truth: suffering often follows no human logic. By framing chaos as divine will, the plays transformed senseless pain into something with intention, however inscrutable. A mother grieving her son could now imagine his death as part of some cosmic tapestry rather than meaningless waste. The genius lay in how these divine resolutions mirrored real Athenian rituals. Just as oracles interpreted Apollo's will at Delphi, theater became a secular oracle, its gods offering closure when human solutions failed. In Iphigenia in Taurus, Artemis' last-minute rescue of Orsts and Iphigenia echoes the civic practice of seeking divine signs before major decisions. The stage gods didn't negate human agency, they contextualized it, reminding viewers that some wounds require more than mortal hands can give. This narrative device worked because it honored ambiguity. Unlike modern storytelling that often ties endings with neat bows, Greek tragedies let gods impose order without explaining it. When Heracles appears in Philoctetes to command the wounded archer to Troy, he doesn't justify the years of abandonment, he transcends them. For veterans nursing grievances over unfair promotions or botched missions, this resonated deeply. Healing didn't require understanding why suffering happened. It meant accepting that moving forward mattered more than looking back. Even the staging reinforced this spiritual balm. Gods always appeared elevated on the theologian, their voices booming from above while mortals craned their necks upward. The physical hierarchy mirrored the emotional one. Humans could rage, weep, and question, but ultimate resolution came from beyond. Yet crucially, these divine endings weren't escapes, they were reckonings. Athena doesn't pardon Orsts, she subjects him to trial. Apollo's oracle in Ion reveals painful truths before granting reunion. The message was clear: gods might provide closure, but only after humans had done the hard work of facing their pain. What makes this ancient approach so startlingly modern is its alignment with contemporary trauma therapy. Psychologists now recognize that recovery often requires radical acceptance, acknowledging that some questions won't be answered, some losses won't make sense. The Greeks ritualized this wisdom through their stage gods, offering spectators a way to relinquish the exhausting pursuit of perfect justice. When the chorus in Hippolytus sings, "What is mortal must be born," they distilled a truth both devastating and liberating: not all suffering needs solving. Some of it simply needs witnessing, by the community, by the gods, and finally, by one's own weary but resilient heart. Rome's conquest of Greece didn't just redraw borders, it severed the sacred thread connecting theater to collective healing. Where Athenian tragedies had once functioned as communal medicine, Roman spectacles reduced drama to bloodsport and pageantry. The transformation wasn't instantaneous but gradual, like a language losing its richest words to translation. By the time Emperor Augustus erected his marble theaters, the chorus, that vital heartbeat of Greek catharsis, had shrunk to a decorative afterthought. Stages once reserved for exploring wartime trauma now showcased gladiators and exotic beasts, their violence stripped of metaphor, their suffering devoid of meaning. The masks remained, but their hollow eyes no longer reflected the audience's grief, only their thirst for distraction. This erosion reveals a painful truth about cultural memory. Healing traditions are as fragile as they are powerful. The Romans admired Greek artistry, yet misunderstood its purpose, like collectors preserving a butterfly's wings while discarding its ability to fly. Take the fate of Euripides' The Trojan Women, a play that had once moved Athenians to tears for their enemies. In Roman hands, it became mere prelude to the real entertainment, staged naval battles flooding the orchestra with water and blood. The subtle alchemy that had turned agony into art was replaced by literal spectacle, where pain was no longer processed but consumed. The shift wasn't merely aesthetic, it reflected a fundamental difference in how these societies viewed human suffering. Greek theater had asked why we hurt, Roman arenas asked how loudly we could scream. When Pompey the Great imported Greek tragedies to Rome, he kept the scripts but discarded the context, staging them alongside elephant fights and public executions. The dissonance was jarring, Sophocles' poetic lamentations echoing over the cheers of a crowd betting on mortal combat. Without the ritual framework of the Dionysia, the processions, the sacrifices, the civic participation, the plays became hollow shells, their therapeutic potential leaching away like wine from a cracked amphora. Even the architecture betrayed this decline. Greek amphitheaters had been designed to foster collective introspection. their semicircular seating ensuring every citizen faced both stage and neighbor. Roman engineers perfected the arch and the vomitorium, herding spectators into towering colosseums optimized for efficient crowd control rather than emotional connection. The very air changed where Greek theaters nestled into hillsides, open to sky and gods. Roman arenas often used velarium awnings, literally sheltering audiences from the elements that had once reminded Athenians of their place in the cosmos. Yet the most devastating loss was the death of the chorus. In Greek drama, these collective voices had been the bridge between individual suffering and societal reckoning. Rome's preference for solo performers and lavish special effects reduced them to decorative interludes, their communal wisdom drowned out by the roar of hydraulic scenery and trapdoor surprises. Without the chorus's guidance, catharsis became impossible, like attempting surgery without a scalpel. The psychologist Carl Jung would later describe the chorus as the voice of the collective unconscious, a concept the Romans seemed to instinctively suppress, perhaps fearing its power to unite citizens against imperial authority. The few who resisted this decline paid a steep price. Emperor Nero's infamous obsession with Greek theater, performing in masks while Rome burned, perverted the tradition beyond recognition. His narcissistic performances turned the healing art into a tool of tyranny, proving how easily therapeutic rituals can be weaponized when stripped of their sacred intent. By the time Christian bishops condemned theater entirely in late antiquity, they weren't banning Athenian tragedy at its height, but its hollow Roman echo, a spectacle already gutted of meaning. This historical unraveling holds urgent lessons. Like the Greeks, modern societies have developed fragile ecosystems of healing, from veterans writing workshops to community storytelling projects. Their power lies not just in the art itself, but in the sacred containers we build around them, the rituals, the spaces, the collective intentionality. When we prioritize spectacle over substance, when efficiency edges out empathy, we risk repeating Rome's mistake, preserving the shell while losing the soul. The ruins of ancient theaters stand as silent witnesses to what happens when a culture forgets that some wounds require more than distraction. They demand to be sung aloud together under an open sky. Centuries may separate us from the marble stages of Athens, but the pulse of healing through performance beats as strongly today as it ever did. Consider the smoldering ruins of post-war Germany in 1947, where audiences huddled in bombed-out theaters to watch productions of Antigone, not as historical curiosities, but as urgent survival manuals. The same play that had once helped Athenians process their civil wars now spoke to Berliners picking through rubble, its themes of moral duty versus state power crackling with fresh relevance. Directors deliberately staged these performances in semi-destroyed buildings, letting the jagged holes in the walls serve as stark reminders that art wasn't escaping reality, it was rebuilding it brick by emotional brick. This tradition took even more radical form in Rwanda after the 1994 genocide. While tribunals handled legal accountability, village squares became impromptu stages for itinerant theater troupes. Survivors and perpetrators alike performed side by side, reenacting scenes of violence not to reopen wounds, but to drain their poison through shared storytelling. The Greek concept of catharsis, emotional purification through dramatic experience, manifested powerfully as Hutu and Tutsi actors traded roles, each inhabiting the other's trauma. Like the ancient choruses who sang of suffering from all perspectives, these performances dissolved the rigid categories of victim and villain, creating space for complex humanity to emerge from atrocity's shadow. Contemporary military hospitals have quietly adopted this ancient wisdom, drama therapists working with veterans don't simply analyze trauma. They reenact homecoming scenes reminiscent of Odysseus' return, allowing soldiers to explore their struggles through mythic frameworks. The Department of Defense now funds programs where service members write and perform plays about their experiences, discovering what the Greeks knew instinctively. Giving shape to chaos is the first step toward mastering it. Even the masks have returned, not carved from wood, but in the form of neutral face coverings that allow participants to safely explore emotions too raw to claim as their own. The most striking modern parallel lies in refugee camps across the Middle East and Europe. Syrian children who have witnessed unspeakable violence process their memories through puppet shows, their tiny hands animating fabric characters to replay scenes they lack words to describe. Like the Athenian audience watching The Trojan Women, these young performers externalize their pain through archetypal stories, distancing themselves just enough to bear what would otherwise crush them. NGOs train facilitators in techniques eerily similar to Greek choral traditions, group storytelling where no one suffers alone, where every cry finds echo and harmony. What would Aeschylus make of a Bosnian production of Agamemnon, performed by Serb and Croat actors 20 years after Srebrenica, or a Vietnamese Medea exploring Agent Orange's intergenerational legacy? These aren't academic exercises, they're proof that the Greeks diagnosed a universal human need. The same neural pathways that once fired in Athenian brains as they watched Clytemnestra's vengeance now light up in modern viewers experiencing similar stories, our biology confirming what their intuition grasped. Trauma isolates, but ritualized performance reconnects, whether in 5th century BCE amphitheaters or 21st century community centers. The digital age has only amplified this ancient tool. Virtual reality now allows Holocaust survivors to return to reconstructed pre-war villages, not to reopen wounds but to reclaim stolen memories. Online platforms host global choirs where war survivors from different conflicts harmonize across continents, their digital chorus lines fulfilling the same function as those circling the orchestra in Dionysia's theater. Even video games, the modern world's closest analog to interactive myth, are being harnessed therapeutically with programs like Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, using motion capture to authentically portray psychosis, building empathy through immersion much like Greek masks once did. Perhaps most remarkably, modern neuroscience has begun mapping why these techniques work. Brain scans reveal that when trauma survivors reenact experiences through fictional frameworks, their amygdala activity patterns differ dramatically from straight recollection. Essentially, the brain treats performed trauma as real but not literal, exactly the liminal space Greek tragedy cultivated. The hippocampus, that seahorse-shaped curator of memory, shows increased activity during dramatic therapy, suggesting storytelling helps reorganize fragmented wartime memories into coherent narratives. Science is now quantifying what Athenian playwrights knew empirically, that healing requires not just confronting darkness, but reshaping it into forms that can be collectively carried. From the ash-strewn stages of 1940s Europe to the augmented reality therapies of tomorrow, one truth endures when language fails: art speaks. The Greeks gifted humanity more than plays. They devised a psychological technology for collective recovery, one that transcends time because it addresses needs woven into our neural fabric. Their amphitheaters may lie in ruins, but the essential design persists wherever people gather to witness their sorrows transformed into song, their private wounds made public liturgy. The masks have changed, but the magic remains. Tell the story together and the burden lightens. Name the pain aloud and its grip loosens. Perform the unthinkable and suddenly, impossibly, it becomes survivable. Lessons from the amphitheater echo across millennia. whispering to our fractured modern world with startling urgency. Picture a divided society, perhaps your own, where political trenches grow deeper by the day, where algorithms amplify outrage, and where the very concept of shared truth feels like a relic. Now imagine transplanting the ancient Greek model into this landscape, not the masks and togas, but the core philosophy that transformed their stages into surgical theaters for the soul. The Greeks understood something we've forgotten, that healing collective trauma requires more than policy debates or therapy sessions. It demands ritual, shared narrative, and the alchemical space where pain becomes poetry. Take the choral model, for instance. In an age where social media herds us into isolated echo chambers, the Greek chorus stands as a radical alternative, a collective voice that neither agrees nor attacks but reflects. Imagine modern conflicts mediated not by talking heads, but by community choruses trained to articulate every perspective with equal empathy. Projects like Rwanda's post-genocide theater troops prove this isn't fantasy. When Hutu and Tutsi actors performed each other's stories, swapping roles mid-scene, they achieved what truth commissions alone couldn't: the visceral understanding that no side holds a monopoly on suffering. This is the chorus's genius. It refuses to let anyone become the other. The Greek emphasis on cyclical storytelling offers another antidote to our crisis of memory. Where modern news cycles reduce wars to hashtags and then forget them, Athenian tragedies returned annually to the same myths, layering new meanings onto old wounds. Consider how differently we might process events like the Iraq War if, instead of fading from headlines, they were ritualistically revisited through art, not to reopen divisions, but to deepen understanding. Veteran storytelling projects like The Telling Project have adopted this approach, with soldiers performing their experiences for civilian audiences year after year. The repetition isn't redundant, it's therapeutic, allowing societies to metabolize trauma at their own pace. Perhaps most revolutionary is Greek theater's rejection of binary morality. In our era of villainizing political opponents, the ancient stage offers a masterclass in complexity. Euripides, the Trojan women, didn't vilify Greeks or glorify Trojans. It showed both as victims of war's machinery. Modern parallels emerge in initiatives like Israel's Combatants for Peace, where former enemies co-create performances about mutual loss. When a Palestinian actor recounts his child's death at an Israeli checkpoint, then an Israeli soldier describes his guilt over enforcing that same blockade, the audience experiences something no policy debate can deliver: the collapse of simplistic narratives. The physicality of Greek theater holds lessons too. In an increasingly digital world where conflict happens through screens, the ancient practice of embodied storytelling, masks, movement, shared breath in a communal space could recalibrate our nervous systems. Trauma specialists now use body mapping with refugees, having them paint their journeys directly onto their skin before performing them. Like Greek masks, these painted bodies allow survivors to externalize pain while remaining protected. The results mirror what happened in Athenian amphitheaters. Frozen grief begins to thaw when witnessed by a circle of faces. What makes this ancient model so vital today is its recognition that polarization isn't just ideological, it's neurological. When brains marinate in constant conflict, they literally rewire toward binary thinking. Greek theater worked as a neural reset, using rhythmic language, music, and synchronized movement to coax minds out of fight or flight mode. Modern adaptations like Theater of War, which stages Sophocles' Ajax for military communities, demonstrate this power. After performances, hardened veterans often speak with startling vulnerability, their defenses disarmed by the play's millennia-old insights about warrior psychology. The ultimate lesson lies in Greek theater's sacred purpose. Unlike today's entertainment industrial complex, which profits from keeping us agitated, Athenian drama aimed for catharsis, not the cheap release of emotions, but their purification. Imagine applying that ethos to our media ecosystems, news cycles designed not to inflame, but to help audiences process events, algorithms prioritizing resolution over outrage. Some indie podcasts like Heavyweight already embrace this, reframing personal conflicts as communal stories with transformative potential. This isn't about nostalgia for togas and laurel wreaths. It's about reclaiming a technology for human connection that our ancestors refined through centuries of war and rebuilding. The Greeks left us more than marble ruins. They left a user manual for collective resilience, written in the language of shared story. The masks may have changed, but the human hearts beneath them haven't. When we dare to resurrect their methods, not in museums but in veterans' halls, refugee camps, and divided towns, we rediscover an astonishing truth. The most effective peace treaty might not be a document, but a play where former enemies take turns wearing each other's masks until no one remembers who started as whom. The glowing praise for Greek theater as a healing force isn't universal. Some scholars sharpen their quills to poke holes in this idealistic view. Behind the mask of catharsis, they argue, lurked a sophisticated tool of social control, carefully calibrated to reinforce the very power structures that caused collective trauma in the first place. Consider how often these plays upheld Athenian superiority. While the Persians humanized the enemy, it still framed their defeat as divinely ordained, subtly justifying Athens' growing imperialism. The same chorus that sang of shared suffering might, in another scene, extol the virtues of obeying one's masters, wrapping rigid hierarchy in poetic meter. Political manipulation wasn't just a side effect, it was sometimes the main event. During the Peloponnesian War, playwrights became unofficial propagandists. Aristophanes' Lysistrata might seem like a feminist anti-war comedy until you notice how it mocks Sparta's dialect while flattering Athenian audiences. Even the supposedly neutral festival judges were political appointees, with records showing victories often aligned with the city's current factions. The emotional crescendo of a tragedy could be weaponized. Imagine the impact when a play about, say, the dangers of Hubris debuted right before a crucial vote on military expansion. The tears shed in the theater might have been genuine, but their political consequences were carefully calculated. Gender adds another layer of critique. While women's trauma was frequently dramatized, Hecuba's grief, Cassandra's prophetic torment, the actual performers and writers were exclusively male. The female perspective became a theatrical commodity, curated and controlled by men. The same society that wept for fictional Trojan women continued to confine Athenian wives to shadowy courtyards, their real suffering silenced behind high walls. Even the supposedly empowering Lysistrata ultimately restored the patriarchal status quo, with the sex strike ending once men promised to negotiate peace, a resolution that likely rang hollow for women watching, knowing they'd remain legal minors with no vote in that peace. The economic realities behind the curtain further complicate the healing narrative. Only citizens free, male and Athenian-born could participate fully. Metics, foreign residents, slaves, and women were relegated to marginal roles or outright exclusion. The therapeutic benefits so eloquently described by Aristotle weren't equally distributed. They were privileges doled out according to social rank. The masks may have hidden individual identities, but they couldn't disguise that some pains were deemed more worthy of catharsis than others. A Thracian slave mourning a son lost in Athens' wars wouldn't find his story reflected in the glorious fallen heroes of Marathon. Yet even these limitations hold lessons about trauma's complexity. The fact that Greek theater could simultaneously heal and manipulate, unite and divide, speaks to art's dual nature. It's never purely medicine or poison, but always both, depending on who wields it and how. Modern parallels abound. Think of patriotic war memorials that both console grieving families and glorify nationalism, or trauma narratives co-opted by political movements. The Greek model reminds us that collective healing requires vigilance not just against overt oppression, but against the subtler ways storytelling can be hijacked to serve power. Their amphitheaters were laboratories of human emotion, proving that when we gather to witness our wounds given form, we must ask not just, does this help us feel? But who benefits from how we feel? Imagine walking into a community center where neighbors who haven't spoken in years, divided by politics, grief, or generations of distrust, are gathered not for debate, but to perform a play about their town's history. This isn't just art, it's modern alchemy, turning the leaden weight of unspoken pain into something lighter, shared. The Greeks understood that healing begins when private wounds become public stories, and we're rediscovering that truth today in surprising places. From Ukrainian villagers reenacting folk tales to process wartime losses to American veterans swapping helmets for actors' masks in therapeutic theater programs, the ancient formula still works. Give trauma a stage, and it loses its power to isolate. Consider how social media, often blamed for polarization, can flip the script when used intentionally. Platforms like TikTok have birthed a new genre of collective storytelling. Survivors of school shootings sharing their experiences through allegorical skits, or refugees stitching together duet videos that mirror each other's journeys across borders. These digital amphitheaters lack the chorus and masks, but they fulfill the same core function, making individual suffering visible enough to become communal responsibility. When a teenager in Seoul watches a laborer in Jakarta perform their daily struggles through song, the algorithm becomes an unlikely bridge, proving that empathy doesn't require marble stages, just the willingness to witness and be witnessed. Theater programs in prisons offer another powerful modern parallel. Inmates performing Greek tragedies discover something startling, their own lives echoing in Agamemnon's pride or Medea's rage. A 2019 production of Antigone in a Maine correctional facility saw incarcerated men grappling with Creon's rigid laws, sparking discussions about justice and redemption that formal counseling sessions had never unlocked. Like the Athenian audiences who saw their civil wars reflected in Thebes' mythical strife, these performers find clarity in the distance that art provides. The masks may be metaphorical now, but the transformation is just as real. Even corporate settings are tapping into this ancient wisdom. Google's Search Inside Yourself program incorporates theater exercises to help teams navigate conflict, while hospitals train staff via improvisational role-playing to process burnout. These aren't frivolous activities, they're structured rituals mimicking the Dionysian festival's balance of emotional release and communal realignment. When nurses reenact difficult patient interactions with colleagues playing family members, they're essentially recreating the Greek chorus function, stepping into others' experiences to find shared understanding. The most profound applications emerge in post-conflict zones. In Colombia, former FARC guerrillas and government soldiers now collaborate on plays about the Civil War, their performances walking the razor's edge between confession and absolution. Like Aeschylus writing The Persians for his former enemies, these actors discover that portraying someone else's pain requires surrendering to it, if only for the duration of a scene. The magic lies in the temporary identities that theater grants. A man who once planted landmines can play a grieving father searching for his child, and in that momentary surrender to another's truth, something unclenches. What the Greeks gifted us wasn't a rigid template, but a flexible principle. Storytelling rearranges suffering into patterns the mind can bear. Whether through TikTok duets or prison theater, community murals or improvised therapy sessions, we're still using their playbook. The mediums have changed, but the human need remains to see our private chaos reflected back with just enough order to make it survivable, and just enough beauty to make the surviving worthwhile. The stage isn't confined to wood and spotlights. It's any space where we dare to turn our wounds into witnesses, our silences into songs. From the ruins of ancient amphitheaters to today's global stages, the thread connecting trauma and transformation remains unbroken. Those sun-baked stones where Athenians once wept for fallen heroes now find their counterparts in community theaters, refugee camps, and even virtual spaces where war's survivors gather to reshape their pain into something shared and sacred. What the Greeks gifted us wasn't just a cultural artifact, it was a living blueprint for resilience, proving again and again that the human spirit can endure almost anything, so long as it has a stage to speak its truth. Think of the Syrian children in Jordan's Zaatari camp, acting out their bomb-scarred memories with sock puppets. Their makeshift theater might lack marble columns and bronze masks, but the alchemy is identical: terror transmuted into story, isolation dissolved in the circle of watching faces. Or consider the veterans' writing workshops where soldiers script their homecomings before performing them, discovering what Odysseus knew, that the journey back from war isn't measured in miles, but in the courage to let others see your cracks. Even the digital age has become an unlikely ally, with apps now guiding trauma survivors through interactive narratives where choices branch like healing neural pathways. The brilliance of the Greek model lies in its refusal to prioritize healing over honesty. Their plays didn't offer cheap consolation. Agamemnon's daughter stayed dead. Ajax's rage still consumed him, but they insisted that even the ugliest truths could be borne when shouldered together. Modern psychology confirms this wisdom. Group narrative therapy reduces PTSD symptoms more effectively than silent suffering. The Rwandan women who perform their genocide memories alongside former enemies, the Bosnian actors staging Medea in buildings still pocked by bullet holes, they aren't chasing closure. They're practicing the radical act of carrying brokenness without letting it define them. Laughter, too, remains essential medicine. Just as satire plays followed Greek tragedies, today's combat veterans tour with stand-up routines about boot camp absurdities, and Ukrainian troops use dark comedy to skewer Putin's propaganda. The mechanism hasn't changed. It's still about stealing power back from pain by refusing to treat it with reverence. When a Marine jokes about mishearing search and destroy as circus and deploy, or a Syrian comedian mimes dictators as squabbling toddlers, they're wielding Aristophanes' most subversive tool, the punchline that sneaks truth past the guards of grief. What makes this ancient practice so urgently modern is its scalability. You don't need a chorus of 50 or a stone amphitheater, just the willingness to turn your story outward. A grandmother in Guatemala recounting Civil War memories to her knitting circle is invoking the same principle as the Broadway benefit for hurricane survivors. The format bends to fit the need, whether it's a TikTok duet linking teens across conflict zones or a full-scale production of The Trojan Women, staged in a Kabul women's shelter. The common ingredient is always the same. Suffering shared ceases to be a prison and becomes a passage. As our world fractures with fresh wounds, climate displacement, digital isolation, wars without clear endings, the curtain hasn't fallen on this ancient technology. It's simply moved to new stages. The park benches where elders whisper survival stories, the Zoom rooms where pandemic orphans perform memory plays, the augmented reality apps that let genocide survivors walk vanished neighborhoods with their grandchildren. The masks may be digital now, the choruses dispersed across continents, but the heart of the ritual beats unchanged. So let's not merely admire the Greeks from a distance, let's steal their methods shamelessly. When your community bleeds, don't just send thoughts and prayers, send storytellers. Turn town halls into temporary theaters where grievances can be performed rather than weaponized. Teach children to externalize their fears through puppet shows before those fears harden into silence. Recognize that every war zone, every trauma ward, every divided neighborhood is a potential orchestra pit waiting for its chorus. The Greeks didn't heal because they were special, they healed because they were stubborn. They kept gathering, kept singing, kept insisting that even the darkest stories deserve an audience. Their greatest lesson wasn't in the scripts they left behind, but in the radical faith that inspired them. No wound is too deep to be healed by the light of collective witness. Raise the curtain.